Hi, everybody. I'm Josh Gamson.
I'm Mike Shriver.
We're elders. It turns out.
There.
That came on fast. So we have very little time, and I have a bunch of questions.
Okay.
And I thought we could do some back and forth. Like,
Sure.
I'll try to answer some of the things that I'm asking you to when
Okay.
when it makes sense. But so we've known each other for forever. So I thought we could start with what we remember about who we were when we first met and what we were doing. So why don't you go first?
I first met Josh in 1988. 1988. Josh was living in an apartment on, I think, 24th or 21st in the Mission, and a beautiful, like, third floor, had great views. And I met Josh because Josh was doing all of the media. Was really focusing on all the media and publicity and marketing, if you will, for ACT UP San Francisco, which stands for the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which is direct action, non-violent group of folks that were trying to end the AIDS epidemic. And we were both, as I remember, very, very young, just out of college. And I remember my first impression of Josh, I don't know if I've ever told you this. My first impression of Josh was that he was incredibly efficient and incredibly focused. He knew what he wanted in terms of our media and how we were going to be portrayed to the press. And he wanted to make sure that those folks who ended up in front of the microphone were coherent, clear, and had a message. And he was either going to get it done or he's going to die trying with us. So
And what were you doing?
What was I doing? At that point, I was part of the leadership of ACT UP San Francisco. I think I was what they called the recorder, which meant I was the chair. I chaired all of the general body meetings, and I was responsible for chairing all the meetings with the committee chairs. So we had all these pockets. There was a media committee, there was state and local issues, there was all these different groups that had their regular meetings, and my job was to convene all of those chairs to then come up with the agenda for our general body meeting that I would then facilitate. Like 50, 60, sometimes 70 people in a room, facilitating using consensus, not using Robert's rules, but using consensus, which meant we never agreed to do anything as a body until everybody in the room was comfortable with what we were going to do. So never by a vote, never majority rules. It was always making sure that it was this egalitarian perspective that said that everybody's voice and everybody's body mattered equally. So there was a sense of anonymity to the structure of ACT UP San Francisco, and unique to ACT UP San Francisco. So.
And also crazy, like really,
insane.
really hard
Oh
to
God.
do. And this is what, when I think back, so I was 27 or 24, I don't know. I was in grad school studying sociology, and I decided that I wanted to study ACT UP because I wanted to be around gay people, and I knew that that was what that was going to be, and I wanted to be around unapologetic that energy, and activist energy. So, and Mike was still, like, we recently were in meetings together. He's still facilitating by consensus in other settings. The skill set that was already there back when we were little, basically, fighting this weird, unexpected fight around a disease that, I mean, it just was all a sort of unexpected kind of thing, at least for me. And when I look back on it, I agree. I was really a really effective media coordinator, and I don't know how I knew how to do that at that age or where I got it from. But every part of this activist movement was really tight. It was really effective for these young people who were, many of whom were, freaked out, just like scared. We're scared out of our minds.
My mom referred to us one time when I was sort of debriefing with her about what was going on with ACT UP. She said, "Oh, it's just it's a collection of idiot savants, is what it is." And in some regards, we had to learn on the fly how to understand clinical trials, how to understand the legislative process, how to understand what street activism meant, what it meant to do nonviolent civil disobedience. Like, these were not skill sets that were handed down to me when I was in college or in high school, and yet they were it was one of those, if you couldn't do it, you were in trouble because it meant that you were going to fail. And for me, I always had this tremendous sense of the urgency of the AIDS crisis, and this was even before I tested positive. But I always understood the urgency because I had friends next to me, and at meetings who had AIDS, who needed drugs in their body, clinical trials, primary medical care, case managers, empathy, non-stigmatized attention. And for me, part of that drive to learn these skills that were not part of my training was this fear that I was going to fail my community. I don't think I've ever talked about that before, but it was really, I had this tremendous sense of I can't fail. We can't fail. This is far too important to fail.
Yeah, because there were people in those meetings who were, I remember Terry Sutton, just like they were facing, he was losing his eyesight, as I recall.
Yep.
And I was just like, I was a naive, protected kid, basically, and I was like teaching myself to write press releases, not that hard. But there were these people. I was like, the stakes were really high, because even for me, when I was like, oh, I'm a grad student, I'm like going to where the gay people are. It's cool, it's fun, and then I'm there, and I'm like trying to coordinate the public face of things, or help coordinate it, and realizing how high the stakes are for the people around me, and maybe for me, I didn't know. And we. I was going to ask you what drove you into it. I just went into it to write a paper, honestly. And then when I was done with that ethnography, and I was, publishing it, then I just kept going with the activism. But I wasn't driven by something else. What got you?
My first ACT UP meeting, I was brought there by a friend, someone who was my current boyfriend at the time's ex-boyfriend. Knew that I had like political leanings, that I was really invested in, and I had done some Shanti trainings and was an emotional and practical support person, and taught HIV actually as the TA for the biology lab at Notre Dame for 7 semesters, because when I was in graduate school. So I had this academic understanding of it. Let me explain to you my experience of activism before I walked into my first ACT UP meeting was my sophomore year of college, when the University of Notre Dame changed its alcohol policy. That it was no longer, if you're an undergrad, you could drink. They actually were beginning to enforce Indiana state laws. And so the student body was up in arms about the alcohol policy. We gathered outside of the main administrative building on campus, the Golden Dome, had a big, let us drink kind of rally, and then when we were all done, everyone dispersed and then came back 2 minutes later to clean up. All the students who were part of the demo came back and cleaned up the grounds because it was Notre Dame, like you can't have a dirty ground. So that was my experience of activism, was you sort of pop up demo and then do the housekeeping afterwards, right, and clean up. It was not at all. I walked into this meeting with Emmanuel, who is one of my friends who actually died of AIDS, and I sat down, and the very first thing they did is they introduced one of the persons at ACT UP who had just died of AIDS, and they had a memorial for him around the circle, and I thought, I don't know if I have the emotional bandwidth for this. I don't know how to deal with death and dying at this profoundly personal of a level. And by the second or third meeting, I was not jaded, but sort of desensitized at that point, because being around death and dying became a regular occurrence. Just it was pattern behavior after that. And so by meeting 2 or meeting 3, I was quite comfortable being in that room, but I remember that first meeting thinking, am I an imposter? I don't know anybody who's done, I don't, and trying to figure out how do I authentically be part of this group, because I love change, I love politics, and is this the right place to be? Was one of my first questions I had to answer.
I felt like sort of an outsider like that too, but I think that the stakes of it, or the emotional intensity of what was happening with people who were so young, are part of what I think my response was to, let me sort of professionalize my activism in a way. Let me be like a really effective, kick-ass activist, because I don't want to think about this other thing. I want to do the work, and I don't know if I'm really wired that way. That's the way it worked out.
But there's something that it just struck me when you're saying that almost phenomenologically, what really, I haven't put this to words yet, but like the youthful arrogance that we had of these young people, like just out of college, a huge number of us just out of college, and this belief that even if we didn't know what we were doing, we were going to do it, and we were going to do it right, and we were going to do it well, and it didn't matter what people did before us. We didn't really care what our predecessors had done. There was a sense of we are the next right thing to happen, which I think is part of our challenge as activists, is to understand legacy. But we didn't have time to figure out legacy. It was like this, get in there, get it done, and we were pretty cocky when the gay rags wouldn't cover us well. We were pissed off. And if you didn't get a good picture in the BAR or the Sentinel, we were mad. If they didn't get our talking points right, it's like this just. And I think that's one of the things that fueled me getting past this feeling of imposter syndrome, was also, my young adulthood, arrogance.
Yeah, it was pretty arrogant.
Yeah.
And it was really sexy.
Oh yeah.
Very
Oh my
social
gosh.
and very sexy. I don't know if you know this part of the
It's how I learned how to be
story,
a gay man, was that.
but yeah, that was actually my next set of questions.
There really is.
The gay piece of it, but it was. We had I only wore the leather jacket. There was only a few things you could wear. It was the leather jacket, which I just pulled out recently again, and tried to refurbish it, and put it back on. But that jacket has its own little history, and it was very, very social. So the people that we're still friends. We have lots of friends from that long ago, as probably more than my college.
Yeah, we have much
that
closer to
has
my.
sustained from college friendships.
Yeah, ACT UP is where I learned to develop my family of choice, which I know is one of those great buzzwords, but it's quite genuine for me. I came out to a family where being gay was not okay. I was in an academic institution where being gay was not okay, and all of my lessons before I came out were this was not an expression that had value. So now all of a sudden I'm in San Francisco, in the epicenter of the most densely gay place in the world, literally, and in the heart of the AIDS epidemic, literally, and how do I have sex? How do I talk to men? And I'm someone who's I'm naturally sort of have a fear of men, so which really complicates being gay.
Yeah, it does.
But, and how do you have sex? How do you have safe sex? How do you negotiate boundaries? How do you learn about feminism? How do you learn about lesbian issues? How do you learn about bi issues when, before that, I had never been in a setting where those words were ever said out loud in any other fashion but as a derogatory term. There was no such thing as pride when those things were said in any academic institution I've ever been in. So now I'm in a room full of people who are cute, smart, who I have a shared passion with. It's okay, we're gonna need to learn how to talk about this, because I'm having the feelings, and how do I date? How do I date these people that I'm getting arrested with, that are my political comrades? Trying to create that language of political movements, at the same time thinking, you're really fucking hot, right? And it's just real. And how do you do that? And I never knew that you could negotiate sex. I never knew that you could negotiate, this is what I like. That wasn't part of my training or that wasn't part of my birds and bees conversation that I barely had with my mom. None of it.
I just feel like we were teaching each other
Everything.
I just didn't know how to do any of that.
None of it.
None of it. Not the activism, not the gayness, not the sex.
Cruising.
I would that I had figured out.
Oh, I hadn't figured that out. I learned that.
But
Bad drag. I learned in ACT UP. Oh yeah.
Yeah, and how to. And then I was very risk averse. I still am very risk averse. So, it was sort of trying to figure out how to do all that without risk. Which was life or death. Felt like life or death was life or death.
Yeah,
And when it's a big challenge, and I was learning from all these, from Eric, from you, from whoever was around. We were just teaching each other. And I just want to say, I have another pathway for this,
Okay.
but before it sounds too rosy and like we were such great activists, the thing split apart at a certain point, and there were always from the beginning tensions that maybe we overlooked because we were so into our leather jackets and our cuteness and our, arrogance. But always tensions between people who were looking for long-term change and revolutionary change, and people who were looking for more immediate changes to the way, to the medical system, access to drugs, that kind of access to pharmaceutical drugs that was already available. So that I just wanted to, I don't know how you remember all that, but I remember feeling it from the beginning, partly because I was studying it, so I had to pick up on all of these things that were going on, but where were the women in that?
There really was the prototypical split between folks that viewed AIDS through the prism of intersectionality, which wasn't a term that we had then, but was an expression that we were acting out of then. So the idea about intersectionality, and those people that were just dealing with immediacy, folks for whom it was literally whether or not they were going to go blind or be able to see. And that tension got exacerbated when ACT UP San Francisco got big, and it really exploded after the AIDS conference was here in 1990. And at a very famous meeting at the Women's Building in the Mission, ACT UP split. And literally split along those lines of the intersectional folks went this way and the drugs in the body folks went that way. And I actually went that way. I left the meeting. I left ACT UP that night.
I did too. I didn't know that you did.
I was one of the facilitators. No, I was one of the facilitators. I was one of the two people that blocked the consensus process that was going on. If anyone knows about consensus, they were making a decision that did not sit well with me. They were gonna vote. And for me, that was a violation of sort of the core principles of ACT UP, and the way they were gonna vote was clear. Treatment issues was gonna go that way, and women's issues, BIPOC issues, needle exchange, everything was gonna go that way. And I, as a person with HIV, was I need both. I need both, and you can't ask me to play Solomon. You can't ask me to split the baby. And so a very close friend of ours and I, Randy Gerson and I, we blocked the consensus, and when they came back, they said, do you still block the consensus? Because they were gonna figure a maneuver around us, and we said, actually, we can't stay. And we walked out of the meeting and stood outside as the meeting then split into its two factions. I'd love to say that when it's split into two factions, what could happen sometimes in social movements is the splitting actually helps, where you really get the focus, sort of immediacy people together, and they can get their rocks up and do it, and then the intersectional folks can really, really move towards systemic change. But unfortunately, the treatment folks kept moving along, and that has, I think, a lot to do with the gay white male bias of the group, and the fact that it's the Castro, and it's, the predominance of the HIV epidemic in the city has been among gay white men. Not the overwhelming distribution, but just the preponderance. And what happened on the intersectional side is it got hijacked by the AIDS denialist movement, AIDS deniers. And in fact, I had two of them thrown into jail when I was working for the mayor as his AIDS czar, because we got death threats from them, because we dared to be public about the fact that we thought HIV causes AIDS, and syphilis makes you more likely to contract HIV because it does, and evidence-based stuff. And the AIDS denialist movement was so powerful here, hijacked the intersectional group and just drove it into the ground and destroyed it. And it was really sad, because one by one, as folks started falling out of the intersection group, people that are part of our core cluster, the arrogant ones, as they started falling, and I mean arrogant in all sorts of love, because I think that's a very heartfelt thing for me to say, but as Laura and Rebecca and Ingrid and Eric and all these people who were part of our family that fell out of that group, it just became vulnerable for being destroyed. And it's one of the saddest things ever to see ACT UP San Francisco's name just go down the toilet, which is why I always say I'm one of the original members of ACT UP San Francisco, which was a direct action, non-violent, because the folks that took it apart were quite violent, quite horrible.
Yes, it doesn't have a happy ending.
No, it doesn't have a happy ending. Which is, if I could,
go.
which also, what I also want you to know is that this is a very Jewish thing to say, but a prophet is never loved in his own city. If you hear folks talk about the AIDS activist movement in these such glowing terms, when you hear people talk about how important we were and how great we were, they clearly were not reading the same papers that we were reading every day for several years of the ACT UP movement. We were pilloried and made fun of, and letters to the editor, and really difficult relationships with reporters. It was really hard on a lot of levels, because for some people the idea is don't rock the boat, like the system likes us, we've got the mayor who doesn't think we're, don't upset the people who are your natural. Does this sound like the BLM stuff that you heard? Like, don't block streets because you don't want to infuriate your supporters, and because you did this, because you inconvenienced me, I no longer support you. We had that just in lavender over and over and over again. It was a really, I think it also helped insulate us too as a community, but it could be very lonely being out there in the general queer community with some people that thought that what we were doing was absolutely misguided and stupid. And we, of course, were convinced that they were absolutely wrong. So
I'm going to switch directions for a
okay.
minute. Can you talk about the Jewish when the Jewish piece came into your life, how you became Jewish?
Oh my God.
And is there a relationship between that part of your life and the AIDS activist and queer life that we've led?
Yeah, it actually does. This does have a happy ending, so I'll preface it with that. So I was in 5th grade, and I was a lot smarter than my classmates. So the school had this great idea of putting me in the library for the year, so that my class could catch up. Well, they left me in the library for a year. And what are you going to do if you're in the library for a year and you're like a little brainiac? I just read every book in the library, including In the Beginning and My Name is Asher Lev by Chaim Potok, who is a Jewish writer, American Jewish writer. And I'm a huge 20th century American literature, particularly 20th century American poetry. That's my area of study. But I read Chaim Potok, and in one of his books, he talks about how these people are talking to each other over centuries by writing in the margins, which he's talking about Talmudic scholars. And this book where you've got rabbis in this century asking a question about a piece of Jewish text. And then a couple centuries later, there's another rabbi answering him. And then a couple centuries later, there's another rabbi answering him, primarily hymns all the time. But they're having this conversation over time. So this idea that Judaism is an expression over time and not place, I thought was just absolutely fascinating. I said to my mom when I was in 5th grade that I wanted to be Jewish. And I'm from an Irish Catholic family, first generation, second generation, both my parents were born here in America, but grandparents all from Ireland, and Irish Catholic. So I was raised to be, if not a doctor or a lawyer, I was going to be a priest kind of environment. And I'm also a person in recovery. And so when I finally got clean and sober, I was in the seminary to become a priest. And when I finally came to and got clean and sober, it's like, wait a minute, I can't be part of an institution that doesn't like me. Because in 1986, the Catholic Church was quite antagonistic towards lesbians and gay men. Very antagonistic. They call us people that were ordered towards an intrinsic moral evil. And I thought, I don't hate myself that much that I want to be part of that party. So I left. But I've always had, my activism was always about this idea that it doesn't matter what you think, it doesn't matter what you believe, it matters what you do. Like, it's all in the doing. So you may like, feminism, or you may like, the idea around, deconstructing patriarchy, but if you don't do anything about it, it's, you're standing in the middle, you don't pick a side, you don't really, for me that feels like an abrogation of your responsibility as a thinking being on this planet. Like, our job is to leave it better than we find it, right? So fast forward to, I just get done with a 4-year stint of doing a drug for my hepatitis C infection that I had, and it was 4 years of just hell. It just destroyed me. But what I would do is I would go back to New York every year to visit one of my closest friends, and I watched her daughter, who I watched being raised from like 3 years old, as Jordan, her daughter, was studying for her bat mitzvah. Jordan decided she wanted to become bat mitzvah, an adult in the Jewish religion. And I watched Jordan study, and I thought, this is kind of cool. Like there's something about this that's sort of ginning back up that idea of like, I like this, what's this Jewish thing? So I watch Jordan do that. And then when I finally cleared hepatitis C and got really great news about the first time that my HIV meds ever worked, which was 2006, it took 16 years for HIV meds to work for me. But I get this great news in 2006, the meds are working. Jordan says, why don't you come back next year for Rosh Hashanah? Just join us for the opening day of the High Holy Days in the Jewish religion. I'm like, great, I'll do that. And I loved it, just loved it. Because as someone who's in the seminary, I mean, you get it. I'm big into sort of religious sort of symbolism and just liturgy, and I mean, it's just in my DNA. I didn't necessarily ascribe to it in the Catholicism side, nor in the Jewish side, but there was something about it. It's like, oh, I like this. This is fascinating. And over time, I would then go back to New York for all 10 days of the High Holy Days. And when one year, right before Yom Kippur, I was in synagogue, and the rabbi that gave the sermon that night talked about Jewish atheism. Mm-hmm. And it was the first time I had ever heard anyone articulate the way I felt as an atheist, and what it could also mean to be Jewish and to be an atheist, because it isn't about what you believe, it's about what you do. And I know the three of them are heard, my students, my guys have all heard this, but the word is orthopraxy. It's about how things get put into action. It's Judaism is an action verb. And for me, that was the easiest way to sort of understand it. And activism is, for me, an action verb. Like you can have all the process you want and the consensus you want, but it matters what happens when you shut down the street or in that meeting or actually do something. Just like I think the AIDS Memorial Grove is an action verb, because I think legacy and memory and storytelling are all action verbs, because it's about making sure no one is forgotten. So for me, it was easy to square like this fifth grader who thought this was just fascinating to have this conversation over time and not place, with this idea that this is a community that believes in doing, and a community that believes in community. And I have an absolute fundamental belief in community. I think that to be alone is the saddest, and I think that's not how we're meant to live. I think we're meant to live in family of choice or family of origin, where it's about like that emergent property, that we're better together than we are alone. And I walked into this tradition that said, well, yeah, that's us. Those are Jews. That's Judaism. That's Judaism all the way. And guess what? We actually like the fact that you like to study, because learning for on its own sake is a mitzvah. It's a good thing to do, and making sure that you make sure that people are doing better in this world is a good thing. So we support that. So for me, it was like this moment of just it was a harmonic convergence, for lack of a better cliche, but it was really this moment.
Meanwhile, he's been to my kids' bat mitzvahs, and I've been to his bar mitzvah, so it all came around. And I'm thinking as you're talking, I don't know if it's like the being born into it and my experience of Judaism. I think the piece for me that connected to ACT UP, queer, whatever, like that part of my identity, was really the uncertainty of Judaism. I feel it as a very searching, constant searching, arguing tradition. Mm-hmm. So that, to me, as somebody, like, if there had been certainty in that tradition that was saying to me, one way or the other, this is, who you are is not okay.
Right.
And it's not that I didn't get that message from being in Jewish settings and being in a Jewish family, whatever. But I got enough of this, maybe this, maybe that, like that part of the tradition made so much room for me to be like, well, all right, I actually think I know, and I'm going to make the argument that this is why I have no apology whatsoever for who I am or what I'm doing, mm-hmm. and let's hear your argument back, which is kind of how it went down. Mm-hmm. And then finding places, communities where the values were the values of inclusivity and including like non-believing.
But one of the things
in God Jews.
Not to give you undue praise, but one of the things that I remember most clearly during my conversion process, which took a long time, I really was, you invited me over to my first ever Seder for Pesach, and I didn't know anything. here's this book, you're reading in the wrong direction, and there's prayers in Hebrew, there's transliteration, and I don't know what the heck. And it's what you did, and it is part of it is a Jewish value, is you made me welcome. Like this idea that you welcome people, and it's your job to make people comfortable. It's your responsibility to make people comfortable in settings where they may not necessarily feel like they belong. And you did that. I mean, it's why I had you read my Angels in America piece at my bar mitzvah, which is my sort of my centerpiece reading, because it meant something to me that someone that I loved, also, who part of the conversion process that's really challenging for converts is this sense of imposter syndrome. Like, am I really legitimately allowed to be a Jew? Because I wasn't raised one. I don't have all these connections. And when you sat me at the table, and I remember Reba's next to me, his daughter Reba's next to me, and you're over there at the head of the table, and Reba's like, oh yeah, we'll get through this. We'll get through this. And it was like, they just walked me through this thing that by the end, when you sing the Dayenu thing, it's like, oh, I get this now. It's like, okay, I'm comfortable. And I think that piece is also, whether or not Judaism lets you argue the hell out of everything, which it does, it also requires that you create this space where people, I mean, I say the word anonymity, and I don't mean it like being anonymous. I mean, it means where everyone has, the playing field is leveled, and no one should walk into a space and feel like they don't belong. And that was the gift that you gave me at that Passover, at that Pesach meal.
You're welcome.
So thank you.
We have time for one last question.
Yeah, I want to steer us towards contemporary activism and what you observe about contemporary queer activism, and if there's something that you want to say to queer activists, but queer activists in particular now, what is it? You know, now we're wise old Jews.
Yeah.
Wise old Jews get to say.
Well, first of all, I think that there's more than enough that needs to be done. I don't think that we exhausted sort of I was afraid when I was studying all like political movements, like, oh, the civil rights movement was great and it's over. You know, the women's lib is done, it's over. You know, gay rights is over. That, you know, there wasn't anything that was going to require me actually diving in headlong and just really getting it all. And I think there's more than enough that needs to be done right now. I still have this low threshold of fury at how bad things are. I don't believe that we fixed enough. And I'm hoping that when you all are 60 and you've gone through 40 years of doing activism, that you have that exact same response, that I don't think we fixed enough, but I think we fixed something. But if we're not addressing the opioid crisis and the fentanyl crisis and the substance use disorder crisis and the homelessness crisis, it's criminal that we're not treating people that use substances as human beings. It's criminal. And so I would leave that challenge to you. I would leave the challenge around sort of what we mean by equity, what we mean by BIPOC visibility from the white community, what we mean about power sharing is about letting go of power and actually figuring out a way in which it's not a zero-sum game where anybody else's gain is my loss. So I would challenge all of you to actually find something that you give a shit about. And don't let go until you're 65 years old and cranky and feel like you haven't done enough. But I don't think there's any other option. And I think to choose to avoid your civic responsibility and become an activist in whatever way you find is most like amenable to you, but to reject that call, I think is dereliction of duty. And I don't care if it's Instagram or if it's TikTok or if it's whatever it is, just find it and do it well.
And the older I get, the more I just want to say over and over again, figure out how to lead with love.
Yeah.
I don't even know what it means exactly. I know it's the true thing to be pursuing, and I don't know how you mix that with the fury and the way I feel right now with the world, with the inhumanity that is all around us, that is just unbelievable. I don't know how you mix those things together, but I know that's the thing that has to be in my head.
Well, yeah, I think the challenge is the idea of how can you hold on to two or three opposing ideas at the same time and recognize that they all have validity without losing your mind and without losing your center, your sort of moral compass.
I think that's where
Is
we'll
that-
have to leave it,
Wow.
Rabbi.
Well, I have one last question.
Uh-oh.
You wanted to come on October 31st, and you said you're gonna be in costume.
I'm a grumpy old man.
I just wanted to
Nailed it.
clarify that he did come in costume, because in fact, you're not grumpy. You're actually someone who has so much hope about people and change. And I don't think I see you as cynical or grumpy at all.
Today is the 1988. Today is the 35th anniversary of my first act of civil disobedience in getting arrested. I was arrested on the Golden Gate Bridge on Halloween of 1988 because I was chaining 75-foot banners to unfurl over the side of the Golden Gate Bridge, and I was in full drag. I was hideous. I'm the first to admit it, but I had a black full-length cowl neck dress. Sleeveless, which was a problem, but there I was, and Dean Willett and I were chaining these banners to the Golden Gate Bridge, and the second banner got caught. We had to keep rolling it up and unfurling it, so that's when we got caught by the police and arrested. So.
And I'm sure I was on the phone to report it.
And then they arrested us and dropped us off at this old fast food place down off of Van Ness called Clown Alley, and I thought, well, this is pretty telling.
I think you'll get maybe a photo of that in the legacy video. We'll actually see your black sleeveless cowl. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This is super special, and I'm really grateful that we have this like on video, and I think it could be the beginning of a series.
Yeah.
Go forth to your